Hello. We've done a lot of the hard work for this course now. We've introduced a large number of concepts and of mechanisms and of equations at the rate of one per slide or two. We'll certainly be introducing new concepts from now on, but not at the same rate. And now, instead, we are going to apply what we've learned to certain key classes of drug action. We'll be discussing for the next 3 lectures the recreational drugs, and then we'll talk about addiction, and then we'll talk about the neural diseases and how the concepts that we've learned so far fit in and what kinds of explanations they give. So let's get started, and our constellation of recreational drugs in this mini lecture has 9 members. Now, I want to explain that recreational drugs don't equal addictive drugs, they don't equal abused drugs, and they don't equal illegal drugs, although among these 9 drugs are some addictive ones, some abused ones, and some illegal ones. You could probably make your own definition of recreational. Mine would be that a recreational drug is used by a person to get a goal that he values, that it's not absolutely necessary for daily life, but certainly is a valuable adjunct to daily life or to pleasurable activities. I don't condone or advocate using any of these drugs, except that I use caffeine, and some people would disagree with that. In this constellation are 9 drugs with reasonably low molecular weights, all less than 500 Daltons, I think. Most of the drugs have a nitrogen atom. 2 of them don't, ethanol and tetrahydrocannabinol. The ones that do can be protonated and deprotonated. We'll talk about that at the moment. And they vary from drugs that have been around for thousands of years to drugs that are relatively recent, within the last few decades. I'll remind you that many of the drugs in the recreational category come from plants. Here's a coca harvest in the mountains of Bolivia several decades ago, and cocaine comes from the leaves of the coca plant. In fact, if we look at our constellation of 9 drugs, most of them do come from plants, and presumably plants use them because the drugs give the selective advantage of protecting the plants against herbivores, against animals who would like to eat them. There's certainly a metabolic cost in synthesizing these drugs, but apparently the cost is outweighed by the selective advantage. So beginning with morphine and its derivative heroin, it comes from the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. These are all the systematic names for the species that give rise to the drugs. And this opium poppy has been used for thousands of years around the world. Tetrahydrocannabinol comes from the marijuana or hemp plant Cannabis sativa. And you note that cannabinol is reminiscent of the title of the plant. Nicotine comes from the tobacco plant, Nicotiana tabacum. The plant tobacco was introduced to the European Society by Jean Nicot, who is the French ambassador to Portugal, in about the middle of the 16th century. Some 6 decades before that, Columbus's crew, setting out from Spain, had received tobacco from the Indians on Hispaniola and brought it back to Spain, where it spread to Portugal. Jean Nicot then brought it to Paris, and the plant and the chemical that comes from it, nicotine, were eventually named after Jean Nicot. We discussed the coca plant and cocaine. It comes originally from South America. Amphetamine is actually synthetic. It was synthesized in the 1930s originally, but it's based on similar molecules from a plant from ephedra. Ethanol has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It does not come from a plant, but is made by a yeast. Several yeasts make it. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is one of them, and the yeasts make it via fermentation. LSD is a purely synthetic molecule, originally synthesized in the 40s, the 1940s, in Switzerland. Caffeine and theophylline come from the coffee, various species of the coffea plant, and tea comes from various species of camellia. And theophylline, which is in tea, differs structurally from caffeine. Theophylline is an analog of caffeine. And finally, phencyclidine, or PCP, is a synthetic compound. Interestingly enough, LSD is synthetic, but it's based on some compounds in ergot, in particular ergotamine. And ergot is a grain fungus. It grows on wheat and rye. And there are some interesting theories published in reputable journals suggesting that ergot infestations of grain in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in around 1630 were responsible for giving people hallucinations that eventually caused the Salem witch trials. Now, we are not going to be able to prove or disprove this theory. And you can take the fact that I'm mentioning this theory as an indication of my desire to treat the world in terms of the actions of single molecules. Let's go back to cocaine, and I will remind you that cocaine base, directly extracted from the plant with organic solvents, is often called crack cocaine, and it is uncharged. It has a tertiary amine. When it's treated with hydrochloric acid, we make cocaine hydrochloride, which is a salt, readily soluble and charged. Treated again with base or heated to drive off the hydrochloric acid gives crack cocaine again, or the so-called free base. As usual, it is the uncharged form, the cocaine base, that permeates through membranes. And so when a person takes cocaine in the mouth, the lungs, or the nose, then the cocaine base is readily permeable through these membranes, gets into the blood, gets into the brain. But before it does that, it is reprotonated. Remember, these protonations, deprotonations, take only a millisecond or so. And so it is the charged form that acts on the dopamine transporter. Now, South American Indians have had the practice for many years of mixing calcium hydroxide from limestone with the coca leaves as they chew them to shift this equilibrium toward the left, to take away the protons, so that presumably they get more coca absorbed more rapidly through their membranes. In general, these drugs have various routes into the body. Morphine or heroin can be eaten, it can be smoked, and it can be injected, mostly for medical purposes, but also by addicts. Tetrahydrocannabinol can be eaten, it gets into the nervous system quite readily, or smoked. Nicotine can be chewed in various forms, either chewing tobacco or nicotine gum. It can be inhaled without being smoked. Even at room temperature, it can be inhaled enough to get into the lungs and across the lung membranes. But when smoked, it is much more effective. Cocaine can be either inhaled without volatilization or smoked, and it can also be injected. Amphetamine and derivatives can be eaten, and amphetamine is found in diet pills. It can be inhaled or smoked, and it can also be injected for a very fast high, speeding. Ethanol is only eaten or drunk. It cannot be inhaled or smoked or injected, to my knowledge. LSD is also eaten or drunk. Caffeine can be eaten or it can also be drunk, as I'm doing at the moment. And for some medical purposes, it can be injected. Phencyclidine can be either eaten or inhaled or smoked. So as we see, there are various routes into the body depending on the detailed chemistry of the molecule that is being used for recreational purposes. Next time we will talk about the targets for these molecules.